Hi everyone, welcome to the Do the Change podcast, where we're challenging and reimagining the field of OEHS. So this podcast focuses on highlighting upcoming leaders in their fields, how they got to where they are today, with a special focus on the field of occupational health, environmental health, but we're also going to be talking about other fields as well. We're going to be talking about the hills and the valleys of these speakers' journeys, and also get some insight into some non-traditional paths into the field or non-traditional experiences while getting into the field. So my name is Tyra Parrish. I'm a recent graduate from the MPH program here at Cal, and our guest speaker for this episode is Makeen Yasar. Did I say your last name?
Yes, you did. Yes, you did.
Awesome. Okay. So Makeen is a radical builder, change agent, poet, writer, and future physician who will be attending Charles Drew College of Medicine as part of their inaugural class for the school's MD program, which is dope. Class is 2027. So Makeen has roots in LA. By way of his ancestors' migration from Kansas City and St. Louis, Missouri. So he was born in Pasadena, raised in Palmdale, California. Sorry, Pasadena is also in California. I'm from SoCal, so I just forgot to say that. These are both in California. And Makeen settled down in LA in his late teens and attended Loyola Marymount University, LMU, where he earned his BS in Health and Human Sciences with a minor in African American Studies. Makeen was also the coordinator for the Office of Equity, Inclusion, and Diversity at Kaiser Permanente Bernard J. Tyson School of Medicine. That is very long for no reason. I'm sure that guy is great.
But, he was fantastic. He was fantastic.
Yeah, long. Makeen also helped lead the development of the institution's Pathway Initiative to support students underrepresented, underserved in medicine. And so before medical education, Makeen was an inaugural, there's a lot of inaugurals in his bio, y'all. he was an inaugural Youth Justice Fellow for the Brothers, Sons, Cells Coalition, where he led youth organizing work in community-based research analysis and justice that centered campaign development alongside Black, Brown, and Southeast Asian students to decriminalize youth and dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline. Makeen is a student assembly representative of the National Health Professionals Research and Advocacy nonprofit, the Social Mission Alliance, and is the founder, co-director of the Umoja Health Project, a volunteer initiative bringing health career exposure, to youth of color. And additionally, Makeen also serves on the board of directors for the Youth Justice Coalition, an organization dedicated to decriminalization of systems impacted youth and their families, as well as the abolition of carceral systems. That's a lot. There's a lot of inaugurals, there's a lot of firsts, and I'm not mad at that. So, Makeen, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Tyra. I really appreciate it. And real talk, I thought you were gonna cut something down for you're gonna say it all.
I saw too many inaugurals in there for me to be like, which inaugural do I cut? Like what? So I just went, I'm gonna just read the whole thing, and however long it takes is however long it takes. But I was like, which one do these all are dope? So yeah, that's what happens when you have a lot of firsts. They all get announced. So
I guess so. Yeah. Greatly appreciate it.
Very
honored and humbled.
It's all good. Okay, so first we're gonna start with just a check-in question. So your check-in question for this episode is describe your dream home.
Oh, dream home. That's a tough one. Because I'm it's funny, I'm not really like picky when it comes to homes, because I know I have some friends who are like, oh, like, my dream home is, to live in, Hollywood Hills, or I want to be on a beachside villa, off the coast of Malibu, I mean, for me, it's just like home is, and I don't know if this is gonna sound cheesy or not, but home is just really wherever my community is rooted in. And so I think that a dream home for me is just a place where, are there things in my home that I would like? Yeah, like I would like it to be big enough for like me and my family, where we could have our own rooms and spaces. But ideally it would be in LA, particularly I would really want a home in the neighborhood or close to the neighborhood where my mom and family, from all my mom's side of the family, grew up in. So like around like Baldwin Hills area. And so, it's not a beachside villa view, but it is one of the, like, if you've ever been to, like, if anyone who's listening has ever been to like Baldwin Hills, like once you're up in that
Yep.
neighborhood, like the Vista View Park area, like the views that you get in of LA are just some of the most beautiful in the city. And so I
Yeah.
think that's the only thing I would need is just to be located in that area because it's familiar. It's
Yeah.
somewhere where my family and my grandparents, my cousins grew up in.
Mhm.
If I could just have a home in that neighborhood, I would be content. It doesn't obviously in terms of specifics, like I don't necessarily want a man cave. Like I don't need
Yeah.
like maybe a hoop out front.
Yeah, that'd be cool. Yeah, yeah.
I wouldn't even need a pool to be honest with you, but I'm
Yeah.
really simple. I'm simple when it comes to material things. So as long as it's like located in that neighborhood, that would be like a
Yeah.
dream for me.
Okay. I mean, I'm not mad at that because I was thinking, I was like, I'm kind of the same where it's like, as long as I'm close-ish to like friends and family, then I'll be like happy, like I'll be content. If I want specifics, I just need like a backyard because I plan on having a dog and that's where they gonna
Mm.
be. So like that's where they're gonna be outside. So I feel like that's like something where I just need a backyard that's just a decent size where like dogs can run around, kids can run around. Like I grew up where we made like made our own water slides that literally was just like something that was slick enough for water. And then we
Oh,
just
I think I know what
ran
you're
and
talking
slid on
about.
it. I don't know
Like
what
a
that thing was.
tarp.
Like a tarp. Yeah. We just do a tarp,
Mm.
get it a little wet with the water hose, and like our backyard is big enough for us to just run and slide. And that was like our makeshift water slide because we didn't have one. So
That's a
um
vibe. No, that's a
yeah.
vibe. We used to be doing that when we were kids too. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's the goal. But yeah, anyways, I'm gonna do a hard shift into
Oh,
our
hardships.
podcast. Very hard shift to our podcast. So walk us through just your journey into the field of medicine. So was the dream always medicine? And were there any pivotal moments or experiences that kind of shaped your decision into medicine?
Yeah, definitely. More happy to share. So for me, like you had mentioned, so graciously on my behalf, I
Yeah, all
was
those.
with all the first.
Yeah,
Yeah, so I was raised in Palmdale, California, like you had mentioned.
yeah.
But my mom's side of the family is from Los Angeles. And when I was growing up, my parents were very affirming in terms of, oh, you could be anything that you want when you grow up. You could be the president, you could be a lawyer, you could be a doctor. And so
Yeah.
it was never one of those things where they were forcing me into a certain direction or trying to
Mhm.
guide me into a certain direction. My dad is an electrician, has been for all of our lives, 30 plus years. And my mom is a social worker. And
Mhm.
so, in terms of like careers and occupations, I had pretty broad ideas when I was like really young in terms of what I wanted to be. Like, I wanted to be a race car driver. Like, I wanted to
That's
be,
cool.
it was just because of Hot Wheels. It wasn't nothing
Like,
deep.
okay,
I,
turn left. That's all you have to do. Turn left. Turn left.
turn left, turn left. I wanted to be an actor at one point. I was actually
Okay.
involved in like my at my elementary school and middle school and a
Uh,
lot of theater productions and I took acting lessons. So I was very into
that's
that.
cool.
But I would say I started gaining an interest in medicine more subconsciously than anything, specifically because when I was growing up, even though we were in Palmdale, which for folks who aren't familiar in terms of Southern California and LA County is a small desert suburb that's about an hour and a half north of Los Angeles City. And
Mhm.
so even though we lived out there, when me and my brother were born, my grandparents, were dealing with a lot of chronic health issues. And so we would go from Palmdale down to Los Angeles just about every week. Every
Mhm.
weekend, we'd stay down there for the summers because my mom was the one who was the primary caretaker for them.
Mhm.
And what that included, obviously, not only in terms of making sure they were taking their medications and not only in terms of helping them with their food and diet, also included just us going to like tons of doctor's offices. So, from the cardiologist to the pulmonologist to the rheumatologist, to the hospital, to the emergency room, like we were always constantly in doctor's offices growing up.
Mhm.
And so, I was always a curious kid. I was always a pretty studious kid. And anytime we were in those settings, I would roam about and have questions for the doctors and the nurses, or my mom would ask them on my behalf because she's extra like that. To be like, teach my baby about the stethoscope. Da, 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 da.
Oh, that's so cute though.
Yeah. And so even though it was embarrassing for me then,
Yeah.
obviously it planted a seed that would later um, come to bear fruit when I was in high school. So at that time, I actually wanted to be a writer heading into my senior year. I love writing. I love, I write and perform poetry and spoken word. And at that point, I was thinking about journalism, but I ended up taking an anatomy and physiology class my senior year in high school. And that was kind of like what influenced me to, want to go the pre-med route or, pursue medicine. It was
Yeah.
just like the fascination that I had in terms of the human body, and just how incredible it was that there were all these systems, all these muscles, all these bones, all these organs that were the things that were driving that were driving us, like the building blocks of life, basically.
Yeah.
And that was just fascinating to me. And I had an affinity in terms of studying it. And I always wanted to help people. And based off of the example that my mom had shown in terms of just like the care and love that she had shown my grandparents, I was like, okay, how do I return that to the folks that I care about in my life, in my community?
Yeah.
So
It's all good.
all right, so to pick up where I left off before I
Uh,
dropped off the call, was
good.
that you know, I'd all like I was saying, I learned that I ended up having an affinity towards studying like the human body and having a curiosity in it. And I'd always wanted to help people. And similar in the way that my mom had cared for my grandparents and modeled that care and that love, I wanted to be able to give that back to my community too. And so the those two pieces, it made sense for me to pursue medicine at that point. And so
Yeah.
late my senior year, I was like, okay, I think this is what I want to do.
Hmm.
And that's when I, made the commitment. I went to LMU. I'm again studied health and human sciences.
Yeah.
When I originally got into LMU, I was actually not sure what my major was going to be. But again, I had, and this was a theme that was just like constant throughout my education and my life journey. I just had a lot of really great mentors, both those who were older, but also those who were like near peer mentors, like people close
Yeah.
to my age, who were just great influences and support systems for me. And so I was in the summer bridge program for students who were underrepresented in medicine. And with my teacher's assistant at the time, she was a health and human sciences major, and
Oh,
she
cool.
was, yeah, and she was the one who ended up convincing me to choose that as a major because it was the one science major that dealt with people. You would get to study the human
Mom.
body, like it was, and I didn't want to study marine animals. I didn't want to.
Hey,
I didn't want to
I
study. You see, you already
I
get
feel
what I'm saying,
attacked.
though.
I feel attacked because I feel like I love LMU. I really do. But I think what it was very unclear that bio versus health and human sciences where a lot of folks were pre-med but were bio majors and didn't realize until it was too late. The health and human sciences actually was best aligned, and you can just kind of take the other bio courses you need for pre-med. So it's
Yeah.
really dope that in your path you had someone kind of direct you to the right way, like straight off the bat. Yeah, so that's really, that girl saved you time.
She saved me a lot of time. A big
Yeah.
shout out to Marina Marmolejo, who's doing
Yeah.
some amazing work on the East Coast, Yale graduate,
Oh,
for their master's in public health program. She's absolutely incredible. But she put me on the right path, and I enjoyed my major immensely.
yeah.
And yeah, so that's how I got to LMU. And in terms of navigating that journey, obviously there were just other instances within my life that continued to affirm me, whether it was in terms of me being in patient care settings and having folks who looked like me say that they were glad to see me and that they needed me in this field, or whether it was in terms of folks in my community and loved ones who were unfortunately victims of like the medical industrial complex in terms of not having access to resources or access to care in their community. and were dealing with health issues that went unaddressed,
Mhm.
that ended up costing them. Like there were just like multiple steps along my journey that just continued to affirm me like this is what I want to do.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's how I ended up finding my way towards medicine.
Mhm.
But just in general, my journey took a little longer than just like
Yeah.
the traditional, 4 years and straight into med school. Like there was a lot that happened in between. So
Yeah. And I think that like a lot of folks think that medical school is like, oh, 4 years, and then you go to medical school, where it's like, no, actually taking time in between can also like better equip you for medical school, and kind of like, I don't want to say go outside and touch grass, but that's kind of what it is, where it's like go outside and meet people, and like really like understand what the community is going through, because there's also the danger of being too ingrained into academia and not really kind of going outside and just talking to community members, and like understanding like what is community health versus kind of like what the institution says is health. Very different. um
right.
yeah. And so I also just want to transition just right into, I'm so glad you talked about medical school at the end, because that is my next question of, why did you choose Charles Drew? I feel like I know why, but why did you choose Charles Drew? And just in general, for folks who don't know, or maybe are listening from like, or from different states, but why does Charles Drew hold really significant meaning, particularly in our community, but also like in the West Coast in general?
Definitely. Yeah. So Charles Drew University, big shout out to CDU.
Ooh,
First things first, they were my first choice.
okay,
And second thing, they were actually my only choice. And I wasn't mad at that. I was not
okay,
mad at that. The med school application cycle is very rigorous.
yep,
It is very challenging. It is definitely, albeit there are so many things that you can do to make yourself be a competitive applicant. A lot of it is also timing in terms of when you submit. A lot of it is, based on that application cycle or year, whether or not you're that fit for a given admissions office in terms of what they think they want a particular applicant to be that year, right?
yep,
And all the same, again, Charles Drew was my first choice, and so I was over the moon when I got an acceptance.
love it.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, the reason why CDU was my first choice just to begin with is because they're just a very community-based, social justice-oriented institution.
Hmm.
And to give a little bit of context about CDU, so like Charles Drew, or Dr. Charles R. Drew,
Hmm.
was a Black man physician who, back in the early 20th century, like early 1900s, was credited with founding the first blood bank. He was an incredible, intellectual physician, scientist, researcher, who
Hmm.
had like a deep love and care and desire to want to see Black people succeed and excel in all their endeavors, even
Yeah.
through the barriers that face them. And so Charles Drew University didn't come until some years after his death. He had died a earlier death,
Hmm.
as a younger man, I think close to his 40s.
Oh,
Don't
wow.
quote me on that. Um, but Charles Drew University has a very interesting history, because it was founded specifically in response to the Watts rebellions of the late 60s.
Hmm.
And so for folks who aren't aware, back in the 1960s, Los Angeles had, like I was saying, so Charles Drew University specifically was actually founded in response to the Watts Rebellion back in the late 1960s. And so for the folks who aren't aware, the Watts Rebellion were a series of rebellions and acts of public defiance back in the 60s that were in response to a lot of public and civil unrest that existed in Los Angeles during the tail end of the civil rights movement, as folks were continuing to experience disenfranchisement. And specifically in this incident, there was a incident of police brutality against a group of Black men in the Watts area that incited public outcry and rebellion in response to their beating, the violence that was done unto them. And so in response to this moment, the city of Los Angeles and the area of Watts, there were like listening sessions done to kind of like assess what were the community's needs at that time. And one of the things that arose from that in terms of a need that was meant to be met was in regards to healthcare and the lack of access to health resources. And so from that moment was the founding of Charles Andrew University. It's specifically a health professions institution, and to give it further distinction, is the only historically Black graduate institution on the West Coast. And so given its history, its founding, and its founding from a moment to provide the needs of its community members, for historically in historically Black communities, Black and brown communities. Charles Drew University has since been one of the leaders in terms of providing diverse classes across the health professions, from nursing, physician's assistant, and medicine. They had a program specifically with UCLA, in which it was a joint program. So, historically, since the 80s, Charles Drew University, if you were to get your MD from the school, it was actually through a joint program with UCLA. And so students who went through that program would get their degree from UCLA and Charles Drew. So you would do your first 2 years, doing your didactic work at UCLA, and then your last 2 years doing majority of your rotation work in terms of clinical rotations at CDU. And just this past year, CDU got accreditation to start their own solo independent medical school program. And so that's the class that I'm going to be a part of.
Yep. That's another inaugural right there. Oh, sorry. It's just crazy how many inaugurals you have, which just shows like you were supposed to be there at that time, which is super cool. So now that you're in medical school, before I jump into the tea time with Tyra, how do you feel? Do you feel, I guess how do you feel after you've now gotten into medical school?
Tyra, I feel the level of relief that I've had since getting in has been it's been the biggest weight off my shoulders that I've ever felt in my entire life.
I love
I remember when I first got when I first got the acceptance, it was just a mixture between hysterical laughing and tears. It was just because obviously, I mentioned, the application cycle was so tough. And this past year, in 2022, in terms of the year that I committed to applying to medical school, was a really rough year, personally for me. There was just a lot going on in terms of responsibilities at work and transitions, and at my job in terms of focuses employment and workload increasing. In terms of being responsible and trying to support my family as best as I could, those responsibilities came up. Inflation, has not made anything cheap at all. And come on, eggs were $15 at one point. So just trying to make it and supporting my folks and trying to go on this career journey. It was just a lot all at once. I had to work full time while studying for the MCAT. So trying to make time for that was a demanding job, was difficult. And, I just knew it wasn't guaranteed. It wasn't that I ever felt I wasn't meant for medicine. It was just that knowing how difficult it is to get into medical school, especially as someone who's, underrepresented in the field, as a Black man. That I wasn't necessarily sure if it was going to be my time or not.
Yeah.
And yeah. And so once I actually got accepted, it was just relief. It's just been joyous. Like I've been so excited to start school, and people ask me a lot if I'm nervous.
Yeah.
And I can't really say that I am.
Mm.
Like it's just been because I waited for this for so long because I finished studying at LMU specifically in 2019. I got my
Yeah.
degree officially in 2020 because that's some other extra courses to take.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've been out of LMU for 4 years now, which is wild to say. And oh my gosh, wow, I'm old. I'm old. But it's all in the right time. It's all in the right time. Because like you had mentioned before, I wouldn't have had half the life experiences that I've had if
Right.
not for me taking the time to explore what it means to be in community, to be present in different organizing spaces, to learn more about who I am as a person and an individual, to work professionally in a space where I gained a lot of skills and understanding of what and how academic medicine institutions operate. And so it just relief and gratitude were the things that I felt, and I still just am excited because at the point of us having this conversation, I'm 2 weeks away now from starting my orientation.
Oh, geez. That's crazy. They didn't even let the ink dry. They just said, okay, so now you start. I mean, it's like, oh, that's just, I'm so happy for you because I can only imagine like that relief or feeling of alignment of like, it's my time now, and then just having to go with it. But I don't know if it's taboo to ask, but do you know where do you want to specialize yet? Or is it like kind of open book as in regards to what you want to specialize in?
Oh, not taboo at all. I'm really interested in family medicine.
Okay.
And I came to that pretty early on, in terms of like wanting to pursue that. So like while I was in undergrad, a big part of like my orientation towards family medicine was just based on some of the experiences that I got in. And so, like one really amazing internship that I had while I was in undergrad was at a local nonprofit in Inglewood called the Social Justice Learning Institute. And I was an intern in their health equity department at the time, back when I was heading into my junior year, like the summer heading into my junior year. And just being able to see, from a community-based perspective, the work that they were doing in regards to, what folks call usually like the social determinants of health, right? So, understanding that, folks' health outcomes are often influenced and determined by the things that they have or don't have access to, whether that be in regards to health, healthcare resources, or whether that be in regards to the education that someone receives that influences their health behaviors, or, on the other side of the coin, the education that they receive that allows them certain job opportunities, things in regards to employment, in regards to food deserts, and whether or not folks had access to healthy foods in their communities, and how this nonprofit was, helping create community gardens across Inglewood and Hawthorne, over 100 of them in schools and parks, and, sharing, that produce for free, across the community. And so like seeing that as an example really inspired me. And I was like, one of the things I was missing from the piece, in my opinion, and where I thought I could fit in would be like in terms of having a physician involved in this type of work too. So having your physician involved in, the community outreach efforts and helping provide health education, and, being able to be a part of the, the more clinical side of things, and, helping individuals in terms of screening what chronic conditions they might have, and, being able to provide, whether it be medical treatment or, counseling in regards to how to, best manage their condition, from a science-based perspective. Another opportunity that I had too that really informed me was that I was actually a medical assistant at a small private practice, and seeing that doctor, her name was Dr. Karima Harani, She was a family medicine doctor as well, and she also got her master's in nutrition. And so, she did a lot of great work in terms of providing like holistic offerings to her patients in terms of nutrition counseling and other supplement-based interventions and treatments, et cetera, et cetera. So like I found pretty early on like that was what I wanted to do. And I mean, to speak realistically, it also would be kind of like the practice that I feel like would give me the most flexibility in terms of like being able to do different things. Because if I was a surgeon, I'd be up in,
crack of dawn.
That oh man.
4 a.m.
4 a.m. on
at
call,
work.
At work. 16 hours. And I was like, no.
Yeah. So I'm really glad that you said just what you said just about in regards to like picking where, or I guess what you want to specialize in, and particularly family medicine, and what kind of frame that. And I kind of want to take that and also jump into like the tea time with Tyra, which basically just talks about what you already kind of mentioned about medical school in general, and applying to it. And also just the barriers and obstacles that kind of come with that, and the ways in which those barriers also, what's the word? They kind of, I don't want to say filter out, but it's like these barriers are part of the reasons why that you don't see a lot of diversity in medicine, just because of how they're set up. And I guess if you don't mind, like kind of talking about some of the barriers for just BIPOC folks and underserved students who are either going through the process of medical school or are thinking of just starting the process of applying to medical school.
Yeah, no, definitely. That's important to talk about honestly and bluntly, right? Because, we have like this terminology where we say underrepresented in medicine or underserved in medicine. The acronym is URIM, right?
Yep.
But, as in so many professional and higher education spaces and fields, there's like context to the reason why, Black, Indigenous people of color aren't represented in those fields specifically. When it comes to medicine, a big part of that was in regards to something called the Flexner Report. Have you ever heard of it? Does it sound familiar?
No, this is my first time hearing it, so I was like, "What?" Please describe. I'm learning too. I'm learning with everybody else.
Okay, for sure. Yeah. So the Flexner Report back in the early 1900s was a federally supported like research initiative in which they were supporting the research of a man named Abraham Flexner, who was researching specifically and evaluating the standard of medical education across schools in the United States. Like the typical way in which we think about the med school route, or the kind of like how med school is structured, is that typically you have 2 years that are focused on developing bioscience and biomedical understandings in terms of understanding like the cardiovascular system, or not the cardiovascular, but all the organ systems, their physiology, anatomy, and how, certain medicines or, pharmacology interacts with those things, right? And then typically the last 2 years are focused on the clinical rotations, that being specifically, individuals getting experience in, inpatient, outpatient settings, typically like, hospitals, and they get exposure to the different specialties in regards to, OB-GYN, women's health, surgery, primary care, internal medicine, and, you get all that exposure and training in terms of your clinical skills, right? That model came from the results of the Flexner report, which at the time, when it had assessed the medical institutions across the United States, found that there was just wide variability and lack of standardization in terms of how folks were doing medical training. In fact, back in like 1800s, like the typical model of medical education before we started, having more higher education institutions being founded in the United States was an apprenticeship model. So you would just like train under a physician, and then at some point, in terms of your receiving that training, you would then be able to get certified as a physician.
That sounds so much better. Sorry, that sounds like, yeah, anyways, that's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah. So, I mean, for some people that works, but for the United States government, it didn't. And and some other things it doesn't work for. And it made, the decision was, okay, so we need a new model, and it ended up being, based on his evaluations, the recommendation based on the assessment was to create this new standardized model so that all physicians were trained similarly, so that they could have similar skill sets and, reduce chances of there being issues with like malpractice or like harm, via like someone who's untrained. But the result of that, and here is where we, examine it from, its impact in terms of impact on marginalized folks, is that this report and the standardization of the medical school training, they decided to then close down schools that did not or could not adopt this model. And they specifically closed down all of the historically Black and Hispanic serving institutions that were providing medical training to Black and brown folks. But if we're talking specifically in terms of the HBCU, specifically Black future physicians, they shut down all the programs except for Meharry, Morehouse, Howard. So I think we went from like 9 to 3. And that had a long-lasting impact in terms of just the number of physicians that could be trained who were Black, because obviously during the early 1900s, segregation was still in play. And so there were still laws that were keeping Black, Indigenous people of color out of higher education institutions, right? And all the access to residency programs, all those access to, training centers, that just all dissipated. And that was kind of like because of the Flexner report. And so I say all that to say, when we think about, us being underrepresented in these fields, it was as a result of a racist policy decision in terms of closing down the schools.
Hi guys, this is Tyra Parrish, your host for this episode, and we have reached the end of part 1 of this conversation with this amazing speaker. Don't click out yet because part 2 to this conversation has already been posted. So go ahead and click over to the next page, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and Spotify page.